Today's story is very interesting. It's from Central Africa. The year is 1921, February. In the Central African Republic, 80 kilometers from the capital, which is Bangui, a bouncing baby boy was born there. He was born into a family of a man who we can say is an African leader. He's a leader in their village. The boy is named Jean Bedel Bokassa. Jean Bedel Bokassa was born when his father was one of the village heads, and his mother who was a housewife, her sole responsibility being to raise her 11 children. Jean Bedel Bokassa was one out of 11 kids born in that household. Okay? So, seeing as the father was, a headman, chief and leader in that area, you could say that Bokassa and his family led a relatively comfortable life. Okay? Until slavery got to them. Remember that by this time, in the 1920s, Central African Republic is under the firm grip of the French rule, okay? And the French came here, they set up their companies. So what do they need? Cheap labor. So where do they get cheap labor from? They would get Africans and put them into forced labor, to go and work in their companies. They soon capture Bokassa's father. Imagine a village elder gets picked up and goes to work under slavery. If you are a leader, you carry yourself with some pride. If someone disrespects you, you will not take it lightly. So when he was picked to go and work in the factory, at some point he told the white men to bore off. I am a leader, you cannot ask me to work for free. Bore off. May the devil lick your faces when you wake up. Of course, the French did not take that lightly. So they ended up subjecting him to torture, and eventually, they killed him because he was defiant. He refused to follow the white man's rules. That report pained his people. Most affected was his wife, Bokassa's mom. She heard about her husband's death, and she could not bear it. She spent a week mourning her husband. She got to a point where she said, I cannot continue with this life without him. Adios muchachos, peace. And she proceeded to live herself. Bokassa is left behind as an orphan. He has to find a way to survive with his siblings who are still young. So what happens to him? He is enrolled into a Catholic school. They act as his parents and they educate him until he finishes his studies. Then, after school, he decides, you know what? Since the Catholic Church has educated me, I can say thank you by becoming a priest. So he tries to be a priest. But I don't know what happens, becoming a priest does not work out. So he decides, you know what? Let me forget about priesthood, let me become a chef and do some flambé. The people who can fill a pan with fire. He tries being a chef, but that does not satisfy him. So by this time the guy is in what? Early 20s. It is now the 1940s. If you know your history, you know very well that between 1938 to 1938 or 1939? To 1944 was the Second World War. And during the Second World War, Africans were being trained to go there to help the white men to fight. So the guy decides, you know what? Being a chef did not work out, let me join the military. Let me go join them. So he enrolls as a military officer. He goes for training and the guy volunteers to the front line. The guy joins the military and does very well. The boy is very good. In fact, the French are very pleased with him. They pick him and tell him that they want him to go and fight elsewhere. And they take him to Vietnam. They go to Vietnam and the guy performs as usual. In fact, he performs above average. Because apart from shooting in the fields, he discovers that there are Vietnamese girls. He gets one of them who was 17 years old. I don't know if at that time there were regulations on underage. He soon impregnates her. But he has to continue with the war. So he bids the girl goodbye and asks her to stay in Vietnam. I have to go and fight in France. Do not worry, we are a family. Let me go to war. And he leaves the wife and the little girl. And he goes to France. And he works in France. Everything goes, perfectly. Eventually they would reunite and they will go to Central African Republic together, where Bokassa was born. Now, while he is in France, we are rolling over to where? To the 60s. And if you know your history well, in the late 50s and 60s there was some kind of agitation. Yes, the struggle for what? The struggle for independence. Countries had had enough of the colonialists. They had had enough of their living conditions. So the countries started to revolt. In 1957, Ghana had said they couldn't take it anymore. The colonialists must leave. They got their independence. Others in 1959. Around 1960, Central African republics said no, not. We have had enough of the French. They have to go. Enough is enough. So in 1960, they got their independence. And when they got their independence, the first president was a man by the name of David Dacko. So David Dacko becomes the president, and he knows very well that Jean-Bedel Bokassa is doing well in the French military. So he sends for him. He tells him, listen, come back home, I need you here. You've been trained, you've fought in wars, you've represented us well. Now your country needs you. So Bokassa goes back to the Central African Republic. He's appointed into the military there, and he rises up the ranks very fast. By the mid-1960s, he's the head of the army. Now here's where the story takes a turn. In 1965, just 5 years after independence, President Dacko is facing economic struggles. The country is poor, the people are complaining, and the French are still influencing things behind the scenes. And Bokassa? He's hungry for power. He sees an opportunity. On the night of December 31st, 1965, while people were celebrating New Year's Eve, Bokassa launched a coup d'etat. By the morning of January 1st, 1966, the country woke up with a new leader. Jean-Bedel Bokassa had overthrown his own cousin, David Dacko, and declared himself president. At first, people thought, maybe this is what we need. He was charismatic, military-trained, strong. But Bokassa quickly showed his true colors. He ruled like a dictator. He silenced opposition, jailed critics, and treated the national treasury like his personal wallet. He had dozens of wives, fathered more than 50 children, and lived in extreme luxury while his people suffered. But the craziest part? He didn't just want to be president. He wanted to be an emperor. He said the title president was too small for him. He wanted to be like Napoleon. So in 1976, he declared the Central African Republic would now be the Central African Empire. And in December 1977, Bokassa staged one of the most extravagant coronations the world had ever seen. He crowned himself Emperor Bokassa I. The coronation cost over $20 million, about 1/3 of the country's entire national budget. He imported a gold-plated throne shaped like an eagle, ordered custom uniforms from Paris, and even wore a 32-pound crown encrusted with diamonds. Meanwhile, most of his citizens were living on less than $1 a day. The world watched in shock. Journalists compared him to Napoleon, but with none of the genius, only the ego. And if that wasn't enough, darker rumors started spreading. Stories of brutality, torture, and even cannibalism were linked to Bokassa. Some say he personally beat and executed students who protested against him. Others whispered that he had a taste for human flesh. Whether all of it was true or exaggerated, his reputation as a ruthless and bizarre ruler grew worldwide. By the late 1970s, Bokassa's empire was collapsing under its own weight. His obsession with wealth and power had drained the country. International aid was being swallowed by corruption, while his people starved and schools crumbled. Still, he demanded loyalty, and any form of dissent was crushed brutally. In 1979, his downfall came from a moment that shocked the entire nation. Students in the capital, Bangui, were protesting against a new rule that forced them to wear expensive, government-mandated uniforms supplied by a company owned by Bokassa's wife. The protests grew louder and more widespread. Bokassa responded with violence. Reports claim that hundreds of school children were rounded up, arrested, and taken to prison. What happened next destroyed any remaining legitimacy he had. Witnesses alleged that Bokassa himself participated in the brutal beatings, and that some students never left those cells alive. The massacre became known as the Bangui Children's Massacre. That was the last straw. The French, who had once supported him, could no longer turn a blind eye. International condemnation poured in, and Bokassa was seen not as a leader, but as a monster. In September 1979, while Bokassa was away on a state visit to Libya, the French launched Operation Barracuda. With the backing of the French army, David Dacko, the very cousin Bokassa had overthrown, was restored as president. When Bokassa returned, his empire was gone. He had been emperor one day, in exile the next. He fled to the Ivory Coast, then to France, where he lived in relative obscurity and faced multiple trials in absentia. In 1986, against all odds, he returned to the Central African Republic, claiming he wanted to die in his homeland. The government arrested him immediately. His trial in 1987 was one of the most sensational in African history. He was accused of murder, corruption, treason, and even cannibalism. The trial lasted months, with witnesses recounting horrifying stories of his brutality. Bokassa, however, denied most of the charges and insisted he was the rightful ruler. Eventually, he was sentenced to death. But later, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment and then further reduced. In 1993, President André Kalingba granted him amnesty, and Bokassa lived quietly until his death in 1996. He died a free man, but his legacy remains one of the most bizarre, brutal, and extravagant stories of post-colonial Africa. A man who crowned himself an emperor, but brought misery to his people.